Once again, this is Othman Al from the English Language Institute of the Royal Commission for Jubail and Yambao. Hello everyone and welcome to our second recorded lecture addressed to students taking the course 118 English Composition 2 at Jubail University College semester 402. As a continuation for our previous lectures on academic writing, today we are going to deal with the introductions and conclusions in the context of writing academic papers. As you all know, you have to prepare a term paper project or an end of semester report as part of the requirements of this course here. So, in trying to do so, among the different components that you have considered in your term paper project in the previous lectures is the part about the introduction and the conclusion. These two parts are very important and you need to give them some special attention. This is why in this lecture today we're going to focus on introductions and conclusion. Now, to start with, let me ask you a question. If you remember in 117, the course that you've had before this one, you have studied writing short essays, and there, if you remember, there are three main components of your short essay, which may include introduction, conclusion, and body paragraph and a conclusion. So definitely, if someone asks you which part are you going to start with first, you would say introduction. Unlike this course here, introductions are not going to be written at the beginning of your term paper. They are going, the introduction and the conclusion are going to be kept at some later stage. So, to start right away, both the introduction and conclusions are very important, simply because the introduction, for example, explains the purpose and the scope of your paper to the reader, so you need to have one. And the conclusion provides a clear answer to any questions asked in the title, in addition to the summary for the main points that you're going to write at the end of your work. So when should both be written? Normally after the main body, as we said earlier. Now, when it comes to the length of the content in the introduction and the conclusion, of course both of them should not exceed more than 10% of the total length of your assignment. But usually, as you're going to see sometime later on, conclusions are a bit shorter than introductions. So for example, if you have a 2,000 word essay, your introduction would be, for example, 200 words as the 10% rate. Now, introductions should include some important components that you can see them here. So what is normally found in an essay introduction? If you look at these 8 parts, you will find that 6 of them should be included in the introduction. These are those which are written in white here. For example, the definition of any unfamiliar term, mention of some sources, your aim, purpose in writing, the method you adopt, some brief background, and any limitations you set yourself. These 2 other parts are not included. They should be somewhere else, as we are going to see it later on. Now, to be practical, let's have a look at some extracts which represent components given in an introduction. Here, if you look at this part here, in the past 20 years, the ability of trial juries until the end of the sentence. This one represents the background. You see, this gives you a background to the study. If you look at the second extract here, the rest of the paper is organized as follows. For example, the first part, blah, 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 the second part, and it goes on. This one gives you the outline. I mean, the key major, the key and major points you are going to discuss in your term paper. I mean, usually you find this through the sequential number here, the first, the second, the third, and so on. This part here, the purpose of the paper here, the purpose of the paper is to investigate blah 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 blah. And this one here tells you about the purpose or the aim or the objective of your study. I mean, you can find that easily through the clue given here, the purpose. You see? When it comes to this part here, there is no clear empirical evidence sustaining managerial myopia argument. Pu et al. 1992, Melbrook et al. 1990, Mahoney 1997, and so on. This one mentions some sources that you have already considered in the literature review before you start writing your paper. So it's very important to mention sources upon which your study is based. If you look at this part here, it starts with social cohesion, and this part here is written in between two quotation marks, and it should be italicized here, and is usually defined in reference to common blah blah blah. Definitely, this is a definition because of the fact that sometimes when you come across some unusual words or concepts which are not clear to the layman or the person who is not majored or specialized in the area you are writing your research, then you have to define these terms. You see, it's very important to give definitions to such terms in your introduction. But of course, it's not a must that in all cases you have to include a definition, because sometimes your work might not require such terms. The last part here, this study will focus on mergers in the media business between blah 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 blah, since with more recent examples an accurate assessment of the consequences cannot yet be made. So this one tells about the limitations. I mean, you have to concentrate on certain areas of the study. You have to be more specific, because if you try to talk about it generally, then you might not be able to cover all aspects. So for example, if you said this study is going to focus on the uses of the internet, this is too general. You have to give some limitations and be more specific by mentioning certain areas of that part. So these are examples of some extracts which represent components that must be used in introductions. Now, when it comes to introduction structure, it is not necessarily to include all the elements mentioned earlier in our previous slide. You see, actually there is no standard pattern that is followed in writing introductions. You see, it depends on the type of your research and how long is it, but generally don't bother yourself about memorizing all these terms used there. The most important part that you have to concentrate on is to include definition of key terms, I mean, if needed, because sometimes you might not need them. You can mention some relevant background information, review of work done by writers on the topic, and this is what we call it literature review, the purpose or the aim of the paper, your research methods, I mean, how did you do your research, and any limitations you imposed, and an outline of your paper. And this is just like what we did in assignment 2, if you remember. See? So again, this time we have an introduction which include some extracts, and it explains how these parts could be written in a logical way. So these extracts are taken from a study called evaluation evaluation of the experience of e-learning for students in higher education. Okay, uh, here you can see these components that we have mentioned earlier uh, as follows. For example, there is a range of definitions of this term, but in this paper, e-learning refers to blah, blah, blah. So here you have uh, uh, the word e-learning as a new concept, for example, that the reader might not understand. Therefore, you need to define it to clarify it carefully so that it might not be widely understood if you just talk about it generally without defining it. This part here, learning is one of the most vital components of the contemporary knowledge based economy until the end of the part here. Here, this one, it is very useful to remind the reader of the wider context of your work. I mean, you have to elaborate on what is mentioned earlier briefly, because this may show the value of the study you have carried out, and this one represents the background part we talked about earlier. If you look at this part here, various researchers, including Webb and Christine, 2003, Hongi et al., and so on. This is very important because in your introduction, you have to mention something about the previous studies, or what we call it literature review, in your study, because you need to mention researchers who have studied the topic previously, and this may also reveal a gap in the research that justifies your work. This part here, the purpose of this study was to examine students' experience of e-learning in higher education context. This one definitely explains the aim or the purpose. And the last part here, a range of studies was first reviewed, and then a survey of 200 students was conducted to assess their experience of e-learning. This one here shows the method that demonstrates the process that you undertook to achieve the aim given there. And this is very clear by using, for example, surveys or interviews. I mean, it could be structural interviews or experiments or so on. So these are the main components that should appear in your, on your introduction. Also, you have to give boundaries. I mean, you have to give limitations to the scope of your study. For example, in this extract here, clearly, a study of this type is inevitably restricted by various constraints, notably in the size of student sample, and this was limited to students of pharmacy and agriculture. So, you cannot deal with every aspect of the topic in an essay. Therefore, you must make clear boundaries or limits for your study. And the last part is the one that tells about the structure of your work, which may help the reader to follow the argument. So, for example, the paper is structured as follows, and you have to mention the parts that we have called them an outline, as you did it in assignment 2 on Blackboard. Now, let's come to the conclusion about introductions here. What is essential and what is optional? Actually, as I have mentioned, things like definitions or mention of some sources or limitations might be important in some cases, and in some cases they might be secondary. Therefore, it's optional to include these parts, but it's very essential to mention your purpose and the method you have adopted and the background plus the outline. These are the four major parts which are compulsory, and you must include them in your introduction. So here we have an example of an introduction. Evaluate the experience of e-learning for students in higher education. And you can see that the first part here is a definition. There is a range of definitions of the term, but this paper, e-learning, refers to blah, blah, blah. So this one includes a definition. The second part here includes background, and this part here is followed by the previous studies, various researchers. I mean, when you try to include some other sources, this one should be in purple here, some sources which we have seen earlier. Let's change it into purple so that it becomes like the other major components. Unfortunately, yes, it's purple here. And let's make it bold. Yes, it's bold. And of course, whenever we come across HE, we mean higher education. This is an abbreviation for higher education. And it goes on, and you can see all the other parts or components which we have discussed in the previous parts. Now, the most important thing is when you start writing your sentences of each of these parts, it's very important that the first few sentences should be general but not vague. I mean, they should be very clear to help the reader focus on the topic. So they often have the following pattern. Usually start with the time phrase followed by the topic, then the development of the idea given here. So for example, you could say currently the control of water resources has emerged as a potential cause of international friction. Just one example. Another example, since 2008, you see, you start with the time expression here, or the time clause here, electric vehicles have become a serious commercial proposition. You see, and this is what you have to follow in the opening sentences for each part that you may need to include in your introduction. So the last part about introduction is this point here. It's important to avoid opening sentences that are over general. I mean, over generalization is not recommended in sentences or statements in your introduction. For example, nowadays there is a lot of competition among different news providers. This is too general statement, and it's not acceptable, because when you say a lot of competition among different news providers, you are talking about this one in such a general way that the reader might not understand which part are you going to concentrate on. On the contrary, it is better to rewrite the same statement more specifically by being more specific. I mean, try to avoid the overgeneralization by rewriting it like this. Newspapers are currently facing strong competition from rival news providers such as the internet and television. Here you become more specific instead of saying, for example, different news providers, because news providers could be, for example, newspapers or social media or TV, whatever. Therefore, it's very important to concentrate on this issue here. So the second example is better than the first one. So we have an activity here. In this activity, I would like you to read these statements here, and I want you to write introductory sentences to these titles here. For example, how important is it for companies to have women as senior managers. You see, you have these questions here. You could have a look at them later on at the end of the lecture, and try to write introductory sentences introducing these uh, topics in the same way that we have mentioned earlier. Of course, if you want to have a look at the sample for the answers, you can just look at your textbook, I mean the 5th edition, the answer key page 275. You'll get the answers there. Now, the last part is the conclusion. And as you know, conclusions usually comes at the end of your term paper, and they tend to be shorter and more varied in format than introductions. Some articles may have a summary or concluding remarks, but for you as a student, your thesis paper should generally have a final section that summarizes the arguments and makes it clear to the reader that the original question has been answered. You see? So, in that case, again, let's try to decide which of the following is acceptable in a conclusion or not. So you have these statements here, statements showing how your aim has been achieved, a discussion of the implications of your research, some new information on the topic not mentioned, a short review of the main points, some suggestions for further research, the limitations of the study, comparison with the results of similar studies, a quotation that appears to sum up your work. Actually, most of these should be included in your conclusion, except see here, some new information on the topic not mentioned before. Of course, in the conclusion, you're not going to add any extra new information. Everything you want to add like this should be in the body paragraphs, not in the conclusion. Also, this part here, a quotation that appears to sum up your work. This is not going to be included in your introduction. So, apart from C and B, all these others should be mentioned in your conclusion. Now, we have an activity here. In this activity, we have some extracts taken from a study. Of course, conclusion. And I would like you to match the extracts from the conclusions below with the acceptable components given here. These are the components. For example, a statement showing how your aim has been achieved, discussion of the implications of your research, a short review of the main points of your study, some suggestions for further research, comparison with the results of similar studies, the limitations of your study. So, and these are the extracts. For example, this study has clearly illustrated the drawbacks to family ownership retail business. As you can see, this one clearly is a statement showing how your aim has been achieved. I mean, the keyword is aim, and where is it? Yes, the aim here, and you have this has clearly illustrated the drawbacks to the family ownership of the retail. Yes, the study has clearly illustrated. You see? And the second extract, the results suggest that the risk of flooding on this coast has increased significantly, and so further coastal development may be at risk. This part simply address, I think, discussion of the implications of your research. You see, this result suggests that the risk of blah 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 until the end. The third extract here, a review of 13 studies of strikes in public transport demonstrates that the effect of strike on public transport ridership varies and may either be temporary or permanent. this one definitely matches. See here, I mean, a short review of the main points of your study. And here, another line of research worth pursuing further is to study the importance of language for successful expatriate assignments. If you look here at this part here, another line of research worth pursuing. You see, worth pursuing here. This one definitely matches D here. I mean, it's about giving some suggestions for further research. And the fifth part here, or the fifth extract, these results of the Columbia study reported here are consistent with other similar studies until the end. This part here goes with E. I mean, you are trying to compare with the results of other similar studies, because you see, it says these results of Columbia study reported here are consistent with other similar studies. So you are comparing, or there is some kind of comparison with the results of other similar studies. And finally, as always, this investigation has a number of limitations to be considered in evaluating these findings. This part here matches F, the limitations of your study. So these are very good examples of how, for example, the components of conclusion could be matched. So please try to do this exercise just by giving the answers and try to discuss it among you in your WhatsApp group. There is another activity here, which is the last activity, that I would like you to understand first. The activity instructions here says the following sentences are taken from conclusion to an essay titled Evaluate the Experience of E-Learning for Students in Higher Education, whose introduction was given above, I mean the previous one that we have seen earlier. But these parts have been mixed up, and I would like you to put them in order. So these are the components. This finding was clear despite the agreed convenience of e-learning, given the constraints of the small and limited sample. There is clearly room for further research in the field. However, our survey, I mean, I would like you to go through them. They are mixed up, and I would like you to rearrange them in such a way that you start with the first one according to the list of, or the organization of the components you have seen earlier in the previous activities, and in the sample of the conclusion you have seen there. So definitely, when you read it carefully after checking the previous one, you should come out with this answer here. You see, this study, I mean the first one is going to be the first. This study found that a little relevant research on higher education student experience of e-learning until the end. Sorry, this is A. So this is going to be the first one, followed by C, however, our study or our survey of until the end. Then the third one, the fourth, and this is the fifth one. So please, when you go home, just try to do this activity once again. And of course, you can do more exercises in your textbook. Just go directly to that part about introductions and conclusions and do the activities given there. And you can check your answers in the answer key there. There is no need for checking further references on this part. What we have there in the textbook is quite enough for you at this time, because I don't want you to get confused by considering different references. So if you have any questions or things that are not clear, you can raise them during our tomorrow's session in the Collaborate Ultra through Blackboard. And before that, you need to study this unit carefully and do the activities. And until then, I wish you all the best.